Okay, it is 12:06, and so I'm going to keep my eye on anyone out for anyone else who's going to be joining us, and ask Gerald to do the same. So we will go ahead. It is 12:06, and we are going to go ahead and get started. And I want to say welcome to the Tucson-Pima County Historical Commission webinar series. It's organized by the Outreach and Training Subcommittee of the Commission. So I would like to recognize and thank Outreach and Training Subcommittee members, Commissioner Kubish, Commissioner Minor, Commissioner Trejo, and note that Commissioner Kubish is tracking commissioner attendance. The webinar is being recorded and will be available for review and to commission members and the public. There will be time at the end for questions, so jot down your questions or use the chat function so you don't forget them for that time that we'll have set aside at the end, as there will be time at the end of our presentation for those questions. So now I'm really pleased to introduce our presenter, Stephanie Phillips. Stephanie is the Senior Program Manager for the Deconstruction and Circular Economy Program for San Antonio's Historic Preservation Office. She's an urban planner and circular economy policy leader in San Antonio. Her work bridges disciplines to inspire more connected threads between material reuse, cultural heritage, workforce development, affordable housing, and climate action and practice. Her role in developing and administering the groundbreaking deconstruction policy in San Antonio has helped inform efforts in communities across the country. And we will be sending out some links to their website. What they're doing is pretty incredible. So thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your expertise with us. And I'm going to turn things over to you. And I want to make sure that you are able to share the screen too when you need to. Okay.
Okay. All right. Can you all see my screen? Do you see the full presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Gorgeous. Well, thank you so much, JJ, and all of you for being here and welcoming me to talk about my favorite topic in the entire world, our Deconstruction and Circular Economy program. I do want to emphasize, as I know that we're talking to a preservation commission, our office is the Office of Historic Preservation. This entire effort was led by our office. And before I was doing this work, I was a senior staff member to our Landmarks Commission. I have a master's degree in historic preservation. So I am one of you, you are one of me, and we're one of the first cities in the country to really lead a policy effort through the Office of Historic Preservation focused on deconstruction. And it's really important to me to emphasize as much as I can that preservation should play a key role in developing these policies. We know our building materials and their histories really, really intimately. We can tell stories about buildings. So I always give a charge to preservationists that this is a space for you, and your expertise is very valued when we're talking about deconstruction. So I want to give a quick overview of San Antonio in case y'all have never visited or aren't familiar. We literally just overtook Philadelphia as the sixth largest city in the country by population. That is a little bit of a misnomer because we just tend to annex the suburbs of our city over and over and over again. So we are actually one of the least dense cities in the country. So I mention that because a lot of the work that we do in the Office of Historic Preservation and what is subject in our deconstruction program really focuses on the historic, core of San Antonio and the areas that developed at the beginning of the city's founding into the 1950s and 60s. So our geographic area is sparse, but we are working with the advantages of a really, really, really big city. Another really important factor, which you'll hear me talk about a little bit more, is that we are still one of the fastest growing metros and regions in the country. And then as a result of that, there's a lot of development pressures, and we see around 500 to 600 buildings demolished every single year that our office reviews and approves. So we have an intimate understanding of what is coming up and what is going down, and that has influenced our policy. I also think it's important to mention some of the climate pressures and considerations, and some of these may sound very familiar to you in Tucson. It is the surface of the sun here in the summer, and I say that as a Midwesterner who still is not used to how hot it gets here during the summer after 10 years of living here. And those kind of have cascading effects that are really important in our climate planning: water and resource scarcity, energy reliability and cost, the conditions and the retrofit needs of our housing. And then another thing that is shared between Texas and Arizona is that there is relatively limited state level climate support compared to some other peers that have deconstruction policies, like the state of Portland and the state of Colorado and other cities that states that are pursuing these policies. And it's really important for me to mention that because that has really resulted in San Antonio as a city taking leadership in developing reuse policies. So we don't really rely on our relationship with the state to move these needles forward, but it allows for us to be kind of the innovative space where these policies happen. And our specific program that we'll be going over today is our Deconstruction and Circular Economy program, which again is housed in the Office of Historic Preservation. This program is relatively new. It was formalized in 2022. And really our goal is to leverage the reuse and repurposing of buildings and their materials in an effort to advance local economic, cultural, and social prosperity. So when it comes to building material reuse and building reuse in general, you hear a lot about the environmental benefits of those. There are vast, but we also want to bring in the cultural and historic preservation dimensions as a key component of our program. And to facilitate the mission of our program, we have 4 primary program areas that our team works on every single day. And by our team, I mean me and one other staff person. There are 2 whole people that do this. The biggest thing that we administer, which we'll talk a lot about today, is our deconstruction ordinance, an actual local law that requires deconstruction for certain building types. And to support that policy, we also have a deconstruction workforce training program. We have a small facility called the Material Innovation Center that recaptures and redistributes building materials, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then something that really undergirds kind of our entire program is our efforts to focus on strategic partnerships and community engagement. It would be utterly impossible for us to do this by ourselves. So it's really, really important to us to continuously build partnerships within the city of San Antonio, the region, and honestly, we're really engaged nationally and internationally on the topic of circular economy in the built environment. So a big part of my job is managing those partnerships. And something that's really important for us to emphasize as well is that we view our program as a demolition alternative, not a preservation alternative. So deconstruction does not take the place of preserving a whole building. That is always the goal. So we leverage the programs and policies on the books in San Antonio to try to keep buildings standing as much as possible. But if a decision has been made for the building to come down, that's where you kind of go down the fork of, does it require deconstruction or can it come down via traditional mechanical demolition? And just that kind of focus on deconstruction being a demolition alternative has also really instilled in us that our program has a hyper focus on reuse for community benefit. So you'll kind of see that as a thread through how our program functions, and the work that we do is really focused on leveraging material reuse to benefit workforce development, affordable housing, arts, culture, education. So we really want this to be something that benefits the community as many ways as possible. And the first program area I really want to highlight is our actual deconstruction ordinance. So we are the largest city in North America currently with a deconstruction policy and actual regulation, and it was adopted in September of 2022. It requires our oldest small-scale housing stock, which I'll elaborate on in a second, to be deconstructed if it is approved for removal. And some key dimensions of this policy that are kind of unique to our city. You'll hear about a few others in this webinar series, but our ordinance only applies to residential structures. It doesn't include commercial or industrial or institutional, although we do have ambitions in the future of potentially expanding our ordinance into those building types. We also took a phased approach to our ordinance. So in September of 2022, City Council adopted our ordinance, and it included automatic expansions. So the first phase of our ordinance only applied to city demolitions, and it applied if the building was built in 1920 and earlier, anywhere in the city, and 1945 and earlier in historic districts or any of our like protective overlays. And then phase 2 took effect in January of 2023, and that expanded to all demolitions, including private demolitions. So if you were a developer or a property owner that wanted to demolish a building, those parameters applied to those projects. And then finally, in January of 2025, we expanded in our final phase, which is active currently. And that expanded the build date to 1945 and earlier anywhere in the city, and 1960 and earlier in those protected districts. So we're starting to inch into the mid-century building types in landmarks, historic districts, and neighborhood conservation districts. We do not have a mandated landfill diversion rate, so we do not mandate that 50, 75%, et cetera, of every single building is salvaged, and I'll explain why. That was a very intentional policy decision. And then another really critical component of our program is that not anyone can just pull a permit to deconstruct a building. You have to be trained first. And we are the ones that certify contractors in deconstruction and put on that workforce training. And I think that's also a really key signature aspect of our program, and I'll talk about why. And then finally, we do require our certified contractors to do a pre-deconstruction and post-deconstruction form. That way, we are collecting data on exactly what was salvaged. It's how we report back to City Council and our budget requirements. So I'll talk a little bit. I'm actually going to show you how that looks like in practice, because some of it is really nerdy when it comes to like the fund preservation stuff that we get to do, and how that influences how our program operates. So I wanted to give you a sense of the timeline for this policy development, because I hear from y'all in Tucson and a lot of other cities like, oh my gosh, we're so behind, like we need to do this like right now. And I want to emphasize, it took us 4 years of dedicated policy development to get an ordinance across the finish line. That may seem like a short amount of time to you. That may seem like a long amount of time to you, depending on your experience with city policies and how quickly they can move. I will say that you'll notice that the policy development happened between 2019 and 2022. We did have a giant pandemic right in the middle of that, so that slowed us down a little bit. But even through that time, we were working on the policy, and I'll kind of take you behind the scenes on what I mean by policy development and what that looked like for us. Here in the blue shades, you'll see the phasing of our ordinance. So the first phase was very brief. We just wanted about 3 months for the city to lead by example and demonstrate to the private industry that the city itself is ready to take on deconstruction, so you all can do it too. Our phase 2 was in effect for exactly 2 years, and now we're in that third and final phase, which is indefinite. And the best way I can describe why we chose a phased approach is we wanted to kind of take bite-sized pieces out of the demolition pipeline and convert those buildings into deconstruction slowly, so that our workforce training can build up contractors to do the work on behalf of those that needed to take down buildings via deconstruction. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about developing the market, making sure the market can handle an influx of reclaimed building materials, because the last thing you want is for a bunch of buildings to be deconstructed and then have nowhere for the materials to go. And that just results in what I like to call taking the long way to the landfill. So we really wanted to make sure that we had the infrastructure, the systems, the contractors in place to really be able to move those materials across the city. And then you'll notice that I also included deconstruction training in this timeline. We started training contractors years before our ordinance got adopted. And that was a really, really intentional decision, again, to start building up awareness around contractor training, awareness around the fact that you could have a career in deconstruction and reuse. And that continues to this day. And I'll kind of show you what our training looks like, because it's one of the most fun part of my job. But I always have to caveat, how in the heck did we get here? How did a Office of Historic Preservation decide they wanted to pursue a deconstruction policy and actually get that across the finish line? These pictures were all taken in San Antonio. The top two are houses that were demolished. The bottom one is a commercial structure that was demolished. So I really think it's important to note that just because we have a deconstruction policy doesn't mean demolition doesn't happen anymore. But what it means is that our oldest building stock that has old growth lumber, amazing wood windows, doors, flooring, siding, shiplap that can be easily reused, especially to repair other historic buildings, is no longer treated like the above. And that was really our goal with developing this policy is enough is enough. This is a bonkers way to do business. How can we leverage policy and programs to kind of mitigate the negative impacts of this on our communities and public health? And I kind of want to demonstrate where we started. I mentioned that we started our deconstruction policy efforts and developments in 2018. And you can kind of see this is the same data set visualized in two different ways. It's just the number of demolitions that were occurring around the time that we started developing our policy. And you can see in 2019, 2020, 2021, we saw a huge uptick in demolitions in San Antonio, nearly 100 or 700 a year. So there was this increasing argument that we were eroding our older housing stock that wasn't protected by a historic district. And that was actually a really key factor in getting this off the ground is a lot of the communities in these hotspots on the map, you'll notice that they're really, really close to downtown San Antonio, but a lot of them do not have one of these like little polygons. So these green and yellow shapes are our historic districts and our neighborhood conservation districts. So those are naturally a little bit more protected from demolition, mostly our historic districts, not our neighborhood conservation districts. But our near west side and our near east side has the exact same housing stock as some of these historic districts. They just don't have the regulatory tool to avoid demolition. But that doesn't mean that they're any less worthy of protection. It's just literally a zoning overlay that determines if it's easy or hard for a building to get demolished. So it's really, really important to us to not just look at our historic district boundaries and our landmarks, but to include all of the building stock that is worthy of preservation or is older or existing, and make sure that we're giving it an opportunity for these buildings to be treated with dignity at the end of their lives, very simply. So the communities and neighborhood associations in our near west side specifically actually advocated our city council to start this process. So you'll hear a lot from other cities that there was a key activist component to getting this on the radar of city council. And honestly, that is a role that a lot of you play, is if you're tired of demolition, let your city council know. And just to kind of formalize that, like this is our position. You know, our work does not end at a historic district boundary. This is a form of preservation too. If we can recapture building materials and develop policies and systems and partnerships to get them back into older houses to restore them, that is absolutely a preservation win. So this kind of ideology is growing among the preservation field nationwide, and we're really excited to kind of spearhead that. So a key step that we took when we were developing our deconstruction policy is we formed a deconstruction advisory committee. And I wanted to break down, you know, who was represented on that committee for you all. We had a bunch of public agencies, so a bunch of city departments spanning from solid waste to housing to public health, as well as our local UT UT San Antonio University, and then our regional council of governments. We also had a lot of nonprofits and community organizations represented. So our preservation nonprofit, a lot of environmental nonprofits were involved in the discussion. And then it was really important to us to also bring in private entities to the conversation, the people that would be most likely to be affected by this work: demolition contractors, deconstruction contractors, general contractors, reuse stores, landfills and waste haulers, and then major developers. We also had land use attorneys on our committee. So it was really important and actually really effective for us to hold meetings pretty consistently that had the most environmental people and the most like pro-development people sharing a room, because that doesn't always happen in practice. And it was really important for us to work together to develop a policy strategy that really made sense for San Antonio specifically. So this is what that advisory committee looked like. And from a preservation perspective, something that was really key in launching our policy development is doing what we do best, which is nerding out over historic research. So I think it was really, really key, and we continue to communicate this, is that deconstruction is not new. It's not like this new fancy thing that we're like making up and telling people to do. It's what we used to do when we removed buildings before we invented the heavy machinery that tears down buildings today. So demolition is actually very new in the scope of our building trades, but deconstruction is a historic trade, and that's how we communicate it. So this is a clip of a newspaper archive from 1965 in San Antonio. And on the left, it's an old post office building. And in a prior article, it mentions how over 200 men were employed to dismantle this building in 1930. And there are multiple buildings on the historic San Antonio Riverwalk, in churches and community buildings, that we can trace where the building materials from this post office went. So the image on the right is an image of a Riverwalk building where the columns from that beautiful post office that was deconstructed were used to restore that Riverwalk facade. So we went around the city a lot into our historic neighborhoods and really kind of emphasized that this is a historic practice, and kind of wanted to tackle head on any concerns that the preservation community had around, oh, we're going to talk about buildings coming down, which can be a scary conversation sometimes. Our advisory committee also really helped us define what our policy drivers were. So these are still the big buckets that drive our program today. Deconstruction advances waste reduction, is really important for sustainability and resilience and public health. But it was also really important for us to communicate historic and cultural preservation, how it helps develop a workforce, and really helps contribute to affordable housing discussions and housing in general, by recapturing building materials that are on their way to the landfill and redirecting them back into community use. And this is an exact slide that was shown to our city council when they adopted our deconstruction ordinance in 2022. We did commission a report in 2021 called Treasure in the Walls, which many of you are familiar with. And we really wanted to start answering some questions and dive into some data that we didn't have initially around, if San Antonio adopted a deconstruction policy, what would that look like? So these are like the big four key issues that moved us forward. We wanted to stop wasting building materials that have monetary value. We wanted to slow down or prevent the outright demolition of older housing stock. We wanted to reduce the public health implications of demolition, which are exacerbated when it's really, really hot here in the summer. And then we also wanted to improve material access and availability. And a key way to do that is to recover building materials from deconstruction instead of sending them all to the landfill. So these were the four key motivations that pushed our policy forward. And just a high-level snapshot of the impact of our ordinance since it was adopted. More than 145 houses that would have been demolished have now been deconstructed. We have an average landfill diversion rate, meaning 60% on average of every single house is being recovered for either recycling or reuse. And through our training program, most of our contractors are prioritizing the reuse of building materials. And what I mean by that is you can see it happening on the screen here from our contractor training. They are pulling out those long, beautiful boards of shiplap in lengths as long as possible. So ideally they can be used again as shiplap. Flooring is flooring, siding is siding, windows as windows, doors as doors. So they're really taught to methodically deconstruct buildings in a way that tries to keep materials intact so they can be reused instead of downcycled. And an example of downcycling is like using this wood to chip it for mulch or using it for waste to energy. So it's really important to us to prioritize reuse. We've had more than 700 tons of materials diverted from the landfill, if tonnage means something to you. And then something that's really important from a preservation perspective is that this policy has instituted a power shift from demolition to deconstruction. And what I mean by that is before our ordinance was adopted, our deconstruction contractors used to tell us sometimes we'll have a demolition contractor call us and they'll say, hey, you have 24 hours to salvage as many materials as you can out of this building until we demolish it. And that is a power imbalance. That is a losing battle. It limits the amount of materials that can be recovered. It requires the deconstruction contractor to act with haste and reprioritize their schedule. Now it's the other way around. The deconstruction contractor is in control. They are on site until all of the salvageable materials are recovered, and then the demolition contractor comes in if they even need to at all. So this is really something that I think is important because to me, this is a really good example of when the government is instituting policies to enact a certain outcome. And the outcome here is to prioritize deconstruction over demolition. So this is what happens when policy can do that. And I promise to take you behind the scenes on what this looks like in practice. So our office and our team specifically looks at every single demolition that comes through the pipeline. And if it looks like it's older, pre-1960, we create this build date confirmation form. And this is where I think preservationists really excel in this conversation, is that we're using a lot of primary sources that you might be familiar with: city directories, Sanborn maps, deed research, newspaper archives, looking at the architecture of the building to confirm the build date of the property. And just an example of what this looks like in practice, this cutie little historic property was coming down, and we needed to confirm that the build date fell under the deconstruction ordinance. So you'll see that Jess, our staff member, looked at city directories. She found a deed of trust that is dated 1919. You'll see that she was looking at city directories to confirm that this building was occupied in 1919. And then here on the Sanborn map, she found that exact structure with the same footprint. So this is a little bit of behind the scenes of the work that our staff does to really make sure that a building is falling under the ordinance, while also developing a bit of a historical record for a lot of times buildings that are a little bit more simple, utilitarian, but also are really important and deserve to have their history documented, in addition to like the beautiful landmarks that are celebrated across the city. And something that we also do is, if necessary, we offer complimentary site walkthroughs with our contractors to identify salvageable building materials. And I love using this building as an example because she's looking rough. Clearly, this building has had tons of modifications over time. It is not in the historic district, but it falls under the deconstruction ordinance. We like to call these houses Frankenstein houses because they just grew and grew and grew, and now it doesn't really have its own personality. However, when you get inside buildings like this, you're always going to find like the beautiful bones, original features of the building. So you'll see original woodwork, really detailed woodwork. Like this was a very, very nice building when it was built. Really gorgeous, thick foundation beams. Sometimes these are 2 by 16. We've had foundation beams that are literally 30 feet long. It's just amazing lumber that you can't find today. Original doors, original windows, and then I carry a hammer and a wrench in my purse literally everywhere I go. So I'm always ripping off drywall, ripping back wallpaper to reveal gold behind the walls. This is like original shiplap that is very easily salvageable. So what we produce from these site visits is we'll define what portion of the building is subject to the deconstruction ordinance. So in this case, we had the original footprint of the building, and then these were additions that were built in 1980. So the contractor is more than welcome to deconstruct those if they'd like, but they're not required to because of the build date trigger. But then we provide an entire list of materials that need to be salvaged, and we'll provide photographic evidence from those site visits. So this is not a requirement for our ordinance for one of these to be produced, but if the contractor really wants this guidance for themselves or to communicate with the property owner, we are more than happy to create this document. And I also want to give a little insight. This ties back to an earlier comment about how our ordinance doesn't mandate that a certain percentage of a building is salvaged. And this is why. So this entire building, it's really difficult to see from the pictures, but it was on fire for a long time. You can see the back here is all charred, but the front facade was relatively unscathed. If we had an ordinance that mandated that 50% or 75% of a building had to be salvaged, it would be impossible because so much of it was burned by fire. But since our ordinance is property specific and flexible, we worked with the certified deconstruction contractor to basically recover what wasn't burned. And you can see more images from that site visit. The back looking rough, these top eaves looking rough, but then you see the parts that weren't charred that are still easily salvageable and can be recovered for reuse. And I believe our certified deconstruction contractor recovered around 23% of the building materials on this structure. And that is a win for us. Like, if it's salvageable, we want it to be salvaged. So just a little insight into why our program operates that way. We get a lot of questions about where the salvage materials go. We do not mandate that they go a certain place, only that they be itemized on our forms. So a lot of times contractors will recover the materials and sell them themselves, or they'll make it to a reuse store where they're sold to the general public. Sometimes the property owner is demolishing a building to build a new building, and they're going to keep this gorgeous material to build that structure. Or my favorite thing that happens with deconstruction, because it takes several days instead of one day, is every single time we do a deconstruction training, we have people coming up to the site saying, hey, my house down the street has the exact same flooring. Can I buy that from you? Because I want to fix some of my flooring, or I want to build an addition and keep that same flooring. So that's what I refer to as like a microcircular economy. That is the best outcome, is now that this building is being deconstructed, the neighbors occupying the building of the same construction era can use this amazing material to repair their building. I started saying that instead of knocking on your neighbor's door for a cup of sugar, you're knocking on your neighbor's door for some shiplap. So that's what we want to see more of, and we're happy that that happens because it keeps those materials in the neighborhoods from which they originated, which is impossible if you're just demolishing the building and throwing it away. We also focus so much on deconstruction contractor training. I'm going to highlight here, this is the statistic that I think is really important to communities that are considering a deconstruction policy, is that we've increased the number of deconstruction contractors that are active in San Antonio by 525% since 2019. So when we started deconstruction training, I want to say we had around 5 contractors doing this work here and there. Now we have well over 45 and into 50. So workforce training works. It's really, really important to make sure that you're not legislating a policy that is technically infeasible to do. So we as the city think it's really important for us to offer these trainings at least once a year indefinitely. We have no plans on stopping. And I'm gonna flip through some photos so you can see what this looks like in practice. So this was from 2 years ago. These buildings were owned by the National Park Service. They were actually on the National Register of Historic Places. But we can't tell the federal government what to do. So they made the decision that these buildings had to be demolished. There's a creek right next to these, and it was becoming, in their words, a flood risk. So they elected to demolish these buildings, but through our strategic partnerships and communication, we offered to host a deconstruction contractor training at these sites because these are really significant buildings, and it was important for us to treat them with care at the end of their lives. So these are just some behind the scenes, taking down those buildings. I love this stage of deconstruction where you can see kind of like the history of the building's occupation over time. The interiors of buildings are very rarely documented through traditional historic preservation documentation. It's largely focused on the outside of buildings. So this is when you really get a chance to see how the building lived and how the building occupants used the space over time, and capture that and add that to the historical record. These are my favorite slides. I mentioned earlier how people always drop by deconstruction sites because it's kind of like a little spectacle. These women dropped by. They were in the like they grew up in the neighborhood where this building was coming down. And after I want to say maybe like 10 or 15 minutes, they like realized they were related to each other through marriage. So that's a very San Antonio thing to happen. And then this best story, this woman was actually born in this house. I guess the owner in the 50s was backing out, and her parents were driving to get her mom to the hospital, and they had a car accident, and she was coming. So she had to be born in the house. And that is information that you would never find in a news article, in like a HABS drawing or the initial research behind a building, because that stuff just isn't documented. But now we're able to document it because people are this is basically oral history collection that we're able to do through deconstruction. And then something that is always true in deconstruction projects is you're always going to find evidence of people reusing building materials to repair a building, like without fail. So this is our contractors and our trainees deconstructing the roof of the primary structure. And at some point, someone was like, hey, that sign, that road sign is coming down. So we're just going to use that lumber to frame the roof. So that is a road sign that was recovered and used to frame the roof. I love this stuff. This is like peak preservation, peak material history. So it's really, really fun when we're able to document this and share this with the community. And then the materials, y'all. I'm preaching to the choir, but we refer to these as non-renewable resources. This is old growth lumber. The lengths are insane. The quality is bar none, and this is what we're able to salvage and redirect into community use. Just one trailer full of gorgeous lumber heading to a new project site. I will briefly mention that the city does have a facility where if people want to donate excess building materials, including an entire gable if they want to, we basically serve as a holding place for excess building materials. And then we also connect materials into community use. And what I mean by that is if people are donating lumber, doors, windows, siding, we can connect them into affordable housing projects that the city is leading. We can funnel them into trades and design education, and we can funnel them into creative community impact projects, including public art and other uses. And just some examples here, affordable housing. This is kind of the path that we now are able to take with this policy and program in place. A deconstruction contractor finds gorgeous siding hiding underneath styrofoam. Crazy. We hold that material until the next project becomes available. And then in this case, siding from 1919 was installed in an affordable housing repair project from 1919 in the same neighborhood. Like this is exactly what we want to happen, and this is where we spend a lot of our efforts working with other city departments to try to prioritize this instead of just using like Home Depot lumber to fix an old house. Because I think a lot of us know that the older materials will weather differently, they're longer lasting, and we want to be able to have a longer lasting repair. And the best way to do that is to use materials from the same construction era. We also work really closely with UTSA and other colleges to do material research. So this is another report that we worked on a few years ago, where an entire architecture studio at UTSA was looking at how reclaimed building materials, if they can't be used for their original purpose, can be used to construct accessory dwelling units or ADUs to help tackle our affordable housing problem in San Antonio. So there's an entire research project that was done using some of the materials that were donated to us. And then a big thing that we're working on right now, we are building our first bus stop shelter out of reclaimed materials. So working with our local public transit authority to try to prioritize the recovery and reuse of building materials that already exist in the city for our bus stops, and instead of, you know, shipping something from across the world. And then I think a really like low-hanging fruit for any city, especially a city like San Antonio or Tucson, where it's so hot and shade structures are so necessary. For us, we think it's a slam dunk to use existing building materials for these shade structures. So instead of harvesting lumber from across the country or the world, or using metal or something else, we're able to use the materials that come into our facility and redirect them into a community project. And the added bonus of this is that we also track where all of the materials came from. So in these instances and the projects that are under development, there's like a little plaque or an interactive QR code or some sort of interactive component to these shade structures where people can actually learn about the history of the materials and where they came from, and the history of the house that was deconstructed to provide these materials. So that's just another way that historic preservation is starting to be integrated into community infrastructure. So I will conclude with these hot tips, because I know that we wanted some feedback on what we think what you should do, what you should not do, what we learned, what we would do better. So some things that were really key to us in developing this program were bringing a diverse array of stakeholders to our Deconstruction Advisory Committee right away. We also prioritize deconstruction contractor training, which I will recommend to any community. We focused on what would work for San Antonio specifically, instead of like looking at another city and trying to copy what they did, because it's really locally dependent on how these programs work. And then number 5, I think, is really great because it's what you're doing now. We contacted as many people as we could in different cities and communities to really learn what was working there, what wasn't working there, to help inform our efforts as well. And then we did some really proactive community engagement, going back to me telling the story of finding newspaper archives, demonstrating that deconstruction wasn't new, to really showcase to the general public that this is a topic worth pursuing here in San Antonio. And some things looking back on our efforts that I wish we would have done earlier. I really wish that we would have formed an inner city work group of different city departments to kind of get to a point where it wasn't just our department leading the effort, but it was more of like a shared leadership experience. And I say that because we still are kind of training other departments on why this is important. And I think we could have gone a little further, a little faster, if we all felt like we had skin in the game, if that makes sense. Another one of these things that I think it's really important to mention is that the people that are actually going to be writing deconstruction policies are your city attorneys. And I think it's really important to engage them early and often. We did have a period in 2022 where we spent literally months just like massaging the legal implications of our ordinance with state and national laws and regulations I was having conversations with attorneys about the constitutionality of our ordinance. So those are things that I think people don't really think about early on, but they're going to have to come into play, these discussions with city attorneys about how to functionally make sure your ordinance works, and talk about things like fines and violations and ways to address that as well. And then I think I mentioned that our deconstruction program was established the same year that our deconstruction ordinance was adopted. I definitely think that we could have shifted some resources and developed more staff explicitly dedicated to this work early on, so that way we could have moved a little bit faster and had more capacity to bring the program to what it is now. And I'm going to end on this slide. I'm going to provide this presentation to you all if you want to get into the nitty gritty of this, but really what this graphic is communicating is that our deconstruction ordinance is at the top. It's the thing, it's what a lot of people want to do. But in reality, there's no way we would have this ordinance without these other building blocks that support it happening functionally. So things like workforce development, reuse infrastructure, engaging your community, partnerships, and data collection and storytelling, I think are really the foundation, and why our ordinance has been working for almost 4 years now, which is wild. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I'm really looking forward to any questions that you have in our remaining time.
Great. So does anyone have any questions? Oh, Kathy, I
Yeah.
know you do.
Oh,
Oh, Carlos or Andrew?
yeah. Whoever wants to go first. I have a few.
Oh, well, let's
Um,
hear your questions, Andrew.
okay. I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through like a brief overview of kind of how this works with your permitting process. You know, once somebody applies for a demolition permit, you know, how is it reviewed? Are there certain inspections they have to have throughout the process? And then I know you mentioned the paperwork at the end that they fill out, but how does that fit into like a normal uh, permitting building process that may be different?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we really intentionally wanted to avoid disrupting the existing demolition permit process as little as possible. So everyone applies for the same permit, a demolition permit, and then our office has a review on every single demolition permit in the entire city. So we basically are able to hold that demolition permit from being issued until the deconstruction requirements are met. And in our case, that's making sure that a deconstruction contractor is brought on board and that pre-deconstruction form is submitted. So that is very simply, that's how it works. And it was designed that way to be as user-friendly as possible to the people that are performing the work.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, because I think that's an area I could see pushback is throwing another wrench in the gears of the permitting process. So that's cool.
Yeah.
Um, the materials that the city off or volunteers to hold, is that at a facility that the city owns, and did they buy it for that purpose, or did you kind of leverage existing sites that the city had for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's actually a site that the city does not own. It is a very bizarre site for the purpose we're using it for. It's located on a decommissioned Air Force base in San Antonio and is basically a former neighborhood of 25 houses built in 1920 that used to house Air Force generals and their families when the Air Force base was active. So it's very unusual. It's not like a giant warehouse like you might expect. But we are holding those materials in like a really long garage that was used for cars when the neighborhood was active. It's owned by Port San Antonio, which is a redevelopment authority charged with redeveloping that Air Force base. And the city leases it for $0. So there is no financial implication for us. And that is a direct outcome of our focus on strategic partnerships. So every single city I can say this confidently, has vacant and underutilized buildings, either owned by the city or owned by nonprofits or partners. So we were able to develop or identify that resource through kind of that partnership development and saying, hey, these really cool old buildings are just sitting there. Can we like put materials in them? And they were like, sure, no one's ever asked us that. So that is currently what we're using. It's not ideal, but it's a start.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, I see Helen, you have your hand up.
Ah, it worked. Okay, my question is sort of at the very beginning. So when you got this idea, you woke up one morning with this dream, right? What were the things that you had to put in place right at the beginning? In other words, was there a need for funding? Was there a need for staff? Like, how could you actually start this, I guess, is my question.
That is a very good question. I will take you way back to the beginning. So I briefly mentioned in my intro that my original role with the Department of Historic Preservation was as basically a landmarks case reviewer. I took on the development of a deconstruction policy as a special project, like other duties as assigned. So at the very beginning, we had no dedicated staff to this effort, and it was a lot of work. There were a number of people in my office that helped contribute to this, whether that was scheduling meetings, reaching out to partners, talking to other agencies around the country about what they were doing. But we really started from not a lot of capacity. And once we started getting a sense from City Council that this is a policy that they were looking to adopt, we were able to have a more focused discussion on staffing needs. So what we ultimately ended up doing about 2 to 3 years into our program efforts were converting an existing staff position into my role. And then once the ordinance got adopted, we converted another staff position into my assistant program manager's role. So it took a while. It wasn't like an immediate allocation of staff. It was really just a special project, which I think a lot of cities can do. It just really takes a director that believes in it and staff that are eager to take it on. I was 25 years old at the time and I had so much energy. So I think that really helped make a difference.
So I guess one of my questions would be then you managed to fund this entirely within the city. Okay.
Yep.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I also want to clarify that we are still very underfunded. If we wanted our program to be bigger and better, like the dreams that we're aspiring to, we're still working on that. And I think that is just the nature of these kind of programs. They're still relatively new. Sometimes it's still unclear like who owns it, but we also have worked with other city departments to help leverage funding in other areas. Like our solid waste department has a lot of funding because they have their own budget. Basically, all of their money comes from the fees that are charged to people that have trash bins and recycling bins versus taxpayer dollars. So they have a lot more money to play with. So sometimes we reach out to them and say, hey, would you be able to contribute some funding to this study or to this workforce training? So we definitely have other pots of funding that come and go depending on the projects that we're working on. And I know that's like a deep topic to dive in on, but if any of you are interested in having conversations in future meetings or one-on-one, I can kind of break down what some of those project budgets look like. We're very scrappy.
Okay. No, this is always the first question you're asked. I mean, we are a commission. We're not city staff. And so one of the first questions that we're going to be asked is, where do you think you're going to get the money to do this?
Mhm.
Whether it's for the training or whatever. And so that is the basic reason that I'm usually the person who says, where did the money come from?
That is, Helen, you're playing a very important role. We also leveraged a lot of grants. So there are a lot of different ways that you can pull in funding. Yeah, but I think our study, our Treasure in the Walls study, was really imperative to show that there are a lot of different ways where we can find funding, and there are also a lot of different ways where we can defray costs of some of these programs through partnerships. So yeah, it's a very important question, and I'm sure there's a path forward for Tucson to fund it for sure.
One of the things, if you are aware of programs that we could apply to for funding, can we pick your brain on that? Not right now, but as a sort of extended project.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it is 1:01. Stephanie, I want to respect everybody's time. Stephanie, do you have time for maybe one more question?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, is there anyone that has one more question?
I had one. I can't raise my hand. I'm sorry about that.
Ah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, first of all, you made my day. I'm so happy. I've been talking about this for years. And then when I saw your ordinance go into effect a few years ago, I was so happy. But I had all sorts of questions, and you've answered all my questions. I was just kind of curious though, did you see a rush to demolish just prior to your ordinance going into effect? Because our developers are so sneaky here. I'm afraid they would do that, or prior to each phase implementation, or did you see an increase in like arson or something like that? And then one other thing, and then I'll mute myself. Did they reassemble that road sign that was in the roof? Because that looks so cool. Anyway, thanks again. Thanks for everything. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Your first question, we were actually wondering if we would see an increase in activity generally and or nefarious activity. We actually didn't, and we can trace that back to our permitting. I think sometimes, I know for us, because we have sneaky developers too, we give them a little bit more credit than we should. Like, there's still a lot of work that goes into demolishing a building, and like, if the funding isn't there, if like the contractor can't be mobilized, like just skirting the ordinance, I think was more effort than it was worth in trying to get ahead of any of the phases. And so no, we didn't see any of that negative impacts, which I hope is the answer you were looking for. And then the road sign, it is actually still hanging out in our facility because not all of the sign was in the roof. It's like they were selective about which pieces they put in the roof. So we actually still don't know what it says. We can infer, I think it was a road sign for one of the San Antonio missions that was across the street. But we are in early talks with a local architecture firm to potentially create like a public art piece in a community center that showcases that sign in the same council district where that building came from. So hopefully it will be on display for all to see with a little bit of the story to tell.
That's so great. Thanks for everything.
Of course, thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I know that there's more questions, but like I said, I want to respect everyone's time. I think if we put a list of questions together, would it be all right if we sent those to you, Stephanie?
Yes, I love answering questions. Please send them all my way.
Yeah, well, I just want to say thank you so much. This is really encouraging, and to the historic preservation community here. And so thank you for sharing all of your experiences and really showcasing how the circular economy benefits a community in so many ways. So
Well,
just thank you again, and thank you everyone for making time to attend. And in a day or so, we'll be sending out the link where you can rewatch or review and encourage others to watch and become acquainted with this whole concept. So everybody have a great day.